All right, hello students. Just to preface this, my cat has been meowing a whole lot outside my door. So if she starts screaming in the middle of this video, forgive me, she's just super spoiled and wants attention. These videos are meant to wrap up all the content for Unit 5 on migration in Mexico, and I'll try to keep them short. So what we're going to talk about right now is how migration patterns started to shift around the end of the 20th century into the beginning of the 21st century, the changes that we see in the wake of 9/11, and then eventually we'll move into how US immigration policy and border patrol policies start to shift. So let's just do it. A lot of these statistics speak for themselves. I don't want to repeat the content of the slides too much. Instead, let's try to focus on some of the data. So, of course, you don't need to memorize any numbers or anything, but be aware of patterns that you can analyze. So if we look at this chart, we see that the number of immigrants from Mexico specifically that live in the United States really starts to exponentially grow once you get to the late 1970s and early 1980s. And if you recall from our previous discussions, we talked about how the economic crisis triggered by the drop of oil prices led to the mass migration of people both within Mexico in search of new employment opportunities and also out of Mexico if they did not find those opportunities within the country. Okay, so hopefully that rings a bell. And along with all that, there's so many other reasons. We've talked about drug trafficking, drug trade. We talked about the increased violence in drug cartels. So it's, of course, not just about economic opportunity. Another major push factor that we need to consider is the fear for their lives, literally, right? So, these statistics I think are interesting. But again, numbers are not what I want to emphasize, but it is interesting to just pause and look at how from 1980 to 1990, we actually have seen the number of immigrants coming from Mexico alone doubling. And then it doubled again from 1990 to 2000. Okay. So this chart is actually looking at the increase in unauthorized immigrants in general. It is not just focusing on immigrants from Mexico. So when we talk about unauthorized immigrants, we mean unauthorized because they don't have the documentation to be in the United States. There's a number of different examples. Some of them are students who came to the United States on student visas. And if their visa expired and they stayed, they too are unauthorized. So a lot of times when people talk about unauthorized immigrants, they're, maybe focusing entirely on people crossing the border from Mexico, but it is far more complex than that. So again, important to emphasize that this is all unauthorized immigrants, not focusing on unauthorized immigrants from any specific country. Again, if we look at not the numbers per se, but the trends, right? So just from the 1970s, a tripling of undocumented immigrants. And yes, the majority of them are from Mexico. But if we look at it and we consider the year, in the 1970s, we're still looking at single party rule. The PRI is the only party governing Mexico. We are looking at of course, by the 1980s, the economic crisis. And what we see along with these numbers is that the United States starts to shift its immigration policy. Okay, so we'll talk about the increased apprehensions at the border in just a second. So just these numbers themselves are pretty staggering, that just by 2000, 7 to 9 million immigrants apprehended at the U.S. border, okay, and half of those are coming from Mexico. So this map that I just put here is also indicating that, yes, despite the fact that you are seeing, of course, a significant number of immigrants that are unauthorized coming from Mexico, actually in proportion, they are declining when compared to the numbers of unauthorized immigrants coming from other countries. Some of them are from Latin America and they are traveling through Mexico en route to the United States, but others are coming from all over the world for a number of different reasons. If you recall in class, we talked about the status of immigrants and the children of immigrants in U.S. K through 12 schools. And these numbers are interesting as well. I actually want to look at the bottom up. Okay, so some students, it's a small percent of students in U.S. K through 12 public schools, at least that we know of, that are unauthorized immigrants. It's important to know that the U.S. public school system is actually not allowed to ask students about their immigration status. So these numbers are not entirely accurate. It's also important for us to look at the number of students who have at least one undocumented immigrant parent. We can infer from that even if the students are U.S. citizens themselves, if something were to happen to that parent, if their parent were apprehended by ICE and that parent was deported, that child may very well go to travel with their parents, right? Because if they're minors, it would be very difficult for them to remain in the United States on their own. So I hope all of that helps enlighten us. And the reason why we talked about that in class is because I think many people are unaware that the Supreme Court actually decided back actually in the early 80s, same time as this oil crisis, right? Same time as we see this uptick in immigrants coming from Mexico. 1982 was the case, Plyler versus Doe. The Supreme Court, it was a narrow ruling, a 5-4 ruling, but the Supreme Court did rule in favor of the students who sued the school district, or actually it was the other way around. The school district, I believe, sued the students, and the students ended up winning the lawsuit. And because of that Supreme Court case, it is constitutional for unauthorized immigrants to attend K through 12 public schools. It stops at 12th grade. The same logic does not apply to students in universities and colleges. Let's pause there, and then we will talk a little bit more. We'll pick up the next video with shifts in Border Patrol policies and also shifts in immigration policies. So stay tuned for that, and thanks.